Yeah, good evening. I hope my English is going to be clear enough, and I hope I'm not going to talk too fast. I'll give myself something like 40 minutes if I feel it's right with you. If I feel I'm losing you, I drop it earlier. Well, I never keep this promise, actually. But, well, thank you, everybody, for inviting me here, the German part, the Romanian part. It's always a pleasure to come back to Berlin. Speaking of infrastructures, I've been working here for a couple of years in the mid-90s, and I've been coming back constantly. And although my background is more like Latin, and I grew up with French and English, I don't speak German, but I think that most of my my activity, which is, well, maybe I need it later. Most of my activity, which is connected to visual arts, happened in Germany or around Germany or through Germany, which is, I think, quite significant in the sense that probably we do not have really in Europe a culture which is so where the consciousness of the visual culture is the importance of the visual is so deeply embedded as it is in Germany. And I think I kind of know what I'm talking about because I've been around more or less in all important cultures in Europe and also across the sea. And I think that the most intense public, the most intense audiences you can get for a contemporary art show are in Germany. Visual arts generally, but contemporary art is a very niche thing. So I think that this is a smart space because it's very packed. You are 30 people, but it's packed, so it's good. So we know the size of what we can do. Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm going to apologize to you because, honestly, there was no time for me to really understand what's expected from me here. And since I'm going through an identity crisis, I just started again working as a manager, let's say as a cultural manager, after a break of, I think, 20 years. Break which I took while moving from Bucharest to Berlin and then to Amsterdam. So that's putting me again in a sort of an awkward position where I have to manage not only what should be done for my colleagues, which is definitely now my priority, but also to manage my multiple identities, one of them being the identity of an artist, and that's very hard. And I think I'm going to and I also didn't prepare anything for tonight, I have to say, except that I started to work on a website, so I hope it's working, otherwise it will be a shame. But anyway, I'm going to try to talk to you a bit about my work, and while doing that, I will try to talk about, the condition of the artist generally. I think that Reinald has, in very few and very well-chosen words, made a sort of a status description of what's going on institutionally speaking in Central Eastern Europe in terms of contemporary art, in terms of the contemporary art scene. And what he, fortunately for himself, doesn't know really is how it was before that. So we perceive what's happening now like a sort of leap, forward, like a paradigm shift. But it's very understandable to say that his assessment is objectively absolutely right. That there is a very interesting and interesting in terms that probably it can cause openings. There is a very interesting tension, I would say, between the level of development of visual artists and the art scenes and art communities, and the level of development of the support system. Would that be the private, would that be state system, or the mixed funding? Because I see it like this. I mean, you have the private system, which would be the galleries, let's say. You have the state system, which are museums, art institutes, etc. And you have something which stays in between, and it's neither private or public, which are the NGOs and which are the collectors. Because a good collector is neither private nor public, Because if it would be public, there would be something different. There would be, you know, mingling with some other priorities which lay elsewhere. But if it would be strictly private, there would be sort of a freak show that collector makes for himself or for herself. And a good collector always looks in a responsible way towards the public and towards the future. And that being said, I mean, for me, of course, the Romanian scene is the most, is the best known, and it's nearest to me. And I can indeed say that there is a huge explosion of talent, and not only of young talent. What is interesting is that through historical and cultural developments, we look back and we discover more and more very interesting names which were around for decades and which we ignored. But that's how it works. Contemporary art works like any kind of domain. It works with fashion, it works with trends, it works with, which are not necessarily something superficial. They are something which defines our sensitivity at the moment, you know. So if we are buying desperately a certain kind of shoes, it's of course something which is pushed on us, but it's also something which resonates with our sensitivity. So if we have a certain kind of works collected or put in this show and in this collection, that's resonating with a certain kind of sensibility, which is a sensibility of now. And probably in 20 years' time, other people are going to make other choices, not because they're other people, but because the times are different. So that being said, it's interesting not that we are looking at artists that we didn't recognize before, but that we are having the need to, you know, to gather more and more information about visual culture and to feel like a body, like a community. And that's something which was lacking before. Now, how far the institutions are able to follow that development or to match it, that's another question. But the institutions are usually slower, so we have to give them some time, and we have to have patience, and we have to push and to wait. That's usually how it works. But unfortunately, of course, you have a big community of artists which have their needs and who are not necessarily, you know, in situation to wait. Now, you see, it was good to have that thing. This is a picture I took, I think, 5 years ago of the place where I'm working now, which is here, actually. Here you have two elevator shafts, and this part of the building is where the Museum of Contemporary Art in Bucharest is located. And the building itself is the most amazing construction ever. It's actually classified, you know, ambiguously between being the largest civil building in the world. That means it doesn't compete with, let's say, symbolic religious buildings like the pyramids, or being the second one after the Pentagon. But the trick is that the Pentagon is very deep inside. That's a very interesting cultural comparison. This building, which is in Romania, in Bucharest, which is the Palace of the Parliament, is big on the outside. So we are more looking towards exposure than towards hidden power, probably. The building from which you see, well, quite something, but it's going also out there. It's symmetrical, so you get a bit of sense of it. I'm not going to zap through pictures. You can easily find it on Google under the tag of Ceausescu's Palace, or the House of the People, or the House of the Republic. And now, as I said, official denomination today is the Palace of the Parliament. It hosts the Romanian Parliament, both chambers of the Parliament, and an array of other smaller institutions which are connected to the Parliament or completely autonomous. And through the, through the you know, a chain of events and coincidences, it's become, part of it became the Museum of Contemporary Art in Romania, a museum which was started in 2001 and which came to be in this location in 2004. And it's a very tiny part of the parliament which is given to us, but still we have to operate something like, I think, 15,000 square meter on 5 floors. And this is huge for any kind of economy or for any kind of culture. It's an an out of scale, out of proportions type of institution for contemporary art, if you think about it. But that's what we got. That's what we have to work with. And for me, it was an interesting development personally to get to become director of this institution. Because of this location, first of all, because I used to live in the neighborhood of this place during the 70s and the 80s, and this location was at that time the historical center of Bucharest, and again through a series of more or less unfortunate events that became part of the master plan of the Ceausescu regime, and it had to be demolished in order to make this building and a set of other buildings around it as the core of the political power in Romania. And that has been a very violent development on the urban scale in Bucharest. There were hundreds of thousands of people who were displaced, because this was a very densely populated area. And also there were a lot of very important buildings which have been destroyed without traces, because this was also a very old area and one of the most interestingly mixed, because Bucharest is a city which developed in fast layers, one on top of the other, from a lenticular Balkan city to a early modern city, to a late 19th century eclecticist city, and to an early modern city, and then it went through Art Deco, and then it started to become something with a combination with another layer of late modern, and then this explosion happened, and nothing remained there. So this is a sort of a very scarred area, and due to the fact that I was living in the immediate neighborhood of it, I could witness very easily the developments, and I could witness the stages of destruction and construction. And through that I started to get another kind of understanding about the significance of architecture and of the urban environment for us as living people, as cultured people. And architecture has been on and off coming in my work with Sabriel, and maybe I can show you a couple of images there. But before that, I'm going to show you a few things which came out for myself from this experience, and the things which I produced in the years 2000 when I was far from Bucharest. I was living in Amsterdam. We're constantly referring to Romania, and more or less indirectly to this building as a symbol, as an embodiment of a political regime which was extremely, brutal, extremely rigid, and which I think left a very deep imprint on our psyche. And the fact that the museum came there was a very hotly debated affair. Now it's more or less accepted publicly because, strangely enough, in the last 25 years, this building became a sort of a branding image for Bucharest. And younger the generations are, less they are concerned about the real history of the building and the real history of Bucharest, or they are concerned in a distant, speculative way. And the injection of humor in the whole story, in the whole affair, is much bigger than it would be in the discourses of my generation or older generations. And through that, and through the, how to say, tacky dimensions of the building, and due to its extreme decoration, both inside and outside, it became something very attractive and very sexy for people to see. And generally, the tourists who come to Bucharest are never avoiding that place. Many of them take some guided tours inside. There are sections which can be visited publicly. And slowly it entered into products, on T-shirts, in pens, etc. So whenever you Google Bucharest, if you look again on the net, you don't have to Google Ceausescu's palace, just Google Bucharest. And first images which come are the images of the Casa Poporului, which turned into becoming a positive image. And that's how history goes. So, in order to make you, to give you a feeling about the city where that building is, and how that city functions, I'm going to show you a small fragment, if the site works, from a film I made in 2003. Because the works I did starting with this film are part of a research project which is called Emotional Architecture. In terms of multi-layering and in terms of the fact that there are constantly different historical times and different stylistic times and different economic times which are meeting with each other there. But also it's kind of familiar. I mean, for people coming from similar cultures, it's extremely easy to be in Bucharest. I spoke with people from South America, people from Africa, from Northern Africa, you know, Turkey, etc. So places where different historical phases are violently confronting each other, and they were always recognizing some parts of their culture in Bucharest, and they were always intrigued by the injunction of the European parts in the more violent. When I'm talking about violence, I'm talking about architectural violence, mind you, not about physical violence in the street, which is fortunately not the case. But the violence of the clash between the European parts of architecture and the parts which are coming from other periods, from other geographical areas, and also from the clash with the parts which were left by the former regime. The person you see here is a contemporary interpretation of a folklore story tale, which is quite popular in Romania, and which is about a funny, stupid, smart guy, a sort of Shakespearean buffoon who is fooled, but also who is fooling other people, and who's been told by somebody, when you leave home, don't forget to pull the door after you. And then in his imagination, that's how you pull the door after you. And he takes it and he carries it with him, you know, along the whole story. And for me, it was a haunting image since I was a kid. And I think it's a very saying image, very powerful image about urban identity and about our migrating identity of people moving from one condition to the other, and from one urban space to the other, and from one type of economy to the other. And I think it's also a very funny image. And I was extremely satisfied with the fact that when I was filming in Bucharest, people were recognizing that character. And even years later, doing studies for other locations and coming to the places where I was filming, people were saying, yeah, there was another guy a couple of years ago here, and he was doing that thing with the door. That was funny. And that's something I sometimes did in my work, also in my work with Sabriel, doing a certain kind of, you know, spontaneous performance following a certain type of discourse in a public sphere, trying to make a kind of photograph or filming something. This is turning into a kind of spontaneous performance, which at that moment is very entertaining for the people. And that's a very rewarding thing, because I think that one issue which is not present enough, oh, that's very sweet, thank you. In our work is direct contact with the public. You know, I have this longing of being an actor on stage and then feeling a vibe in the audiences, and that's very rewarding, very instantaneous, and that's really clearing the things up. That's why I think that talking to your audiences is very important, because it adds another layer to. Definitely another layer to what you do. I think that this film, which I researched for a couple of years, really wandering around the city, or going with the cab and then stopping and then wandering around the cab location and coming back. So through this I got a very clear feeling of what the city was. Although I lived there for 20 years, I didn't know it. And due to the changes in the 80s and the 90s, I knew it even less. And I tried to find those crisis points I told you about and to bring them forward to the public through this, wandering of the character. And then I thought that probably the identity of Bucharest being so strong, it would be very important for us to bring it more in our work. And I was trying to, gather a small group of interest from amongst my colleagues around this matter. And it's rather ironic looking back, because nothing happened. And then, a couple of years later, when I gave up this idea, there was a young generation. And I remember now, because Vlad Nanka, one of the artists in the exhibition here, was, I think, central to this new trend. They started to identify themselves with the problems I worked with a few years ago. And they started to work with the city in a very direct, a very innovative way, and to make Bucharest the centerpiece of their discourse, and to try to bring people from the outside, which of course they could do very easily, because they were part of a generation which was communicating with each other very, that's the club generation, that's the music generation. So they were gathering very quickly, and they were able to open up spaces in their own apartments and do all kind of normal things which in my generation would have been completely abnormal. And since then, I think that there is more and more coagulation about the issues of Bucharest, and there are, man, this goes fast. There are a lot of categories of people, young architects, theoreticians, musicians, visual artists, who are working in a very sustained way and in a very sustainable way with the city of Bucharest, and that makes it a very vibrant place for me. And of course, when I took over that position at the museum, I was thinking, why am I doing really that? Because I can't say that I'm doing it for myself, to work within the building, which was obsessively part of my artistic discourse. And then I immediately realized that basically such an institution can be an interface between the building and the community around it, or the communities around it, because through the bombing of such a building in a very dense urban issue, a lot of things happened, and there is an area of very mixed social situations there. You have very poor people, you have people coming from creative industries, you have the hip people, you have also some rich people who started to develop projects. You have a lot of creative people, musicians, designers, artists who are trying to set themselves up and set up initiatives in the area. And you have the very, very poor people. You have a lot of Roma people in that place. And that makes it very interesting, very intriguing, and very complicated, in the sense that also the museum, the fact that it is in that building, is also very distant from the community around it. And I think that bridging with those communities is is one of our tasks there. And I'm not talking necessarily only about the art community and the creative communities, but also with the people in the area. And I think that this is something we will do more consistently. And also I think that we have a responsibility not necessarily to discuss the identity of a museum of contemporary art in a political location, but to use a museum of contemporary art as a research tool in order to look at the very complex and very suggestive for Romania, not only for Romania, history of that building in general. So there you go. When I'm leaving this evening, my identity is fully repaired. Okay. So I, by the way, Sample City is part of the collection of NBK, so to show you how important I'm in Berlin. So if you you can see it there, really. And another seriously, a very important link between myself and Berlin is Sabriel. This is an artist group, initially a trio and currently a duo. We're like a rock band. We have our fights and then we split. So Sabriel as a duo came to Berlin in came to Berlin in 1995 on a fellowship at Kunsthaus Bethanien, and to my shame I have to say that it was a Philip Morris fellowship. And in 1995 I didn't understand why people were looking like, you guys are on a Philip Morris fellowship. And I say, yeah. And everybody was smoking and said, well, that's not correct. It's Philip Morris, you know. I say, yeah, okay. So we spent a year in Kunsthaus Bethanien, and we developed there a project which was called the Art History Archive. So now you can really see that I didn't prepare my presence here, because usually I'm much more fluent in what I'm doing. But you'll apologize. See, I apologize. You see, the first work we did with Sabriel in 1990 was already having Casa Poporului in the Palace of Ceausescu at its center. It was a public intervention on a boulevard in front of it. And it was like trying to see, so what's going to the police say? Because we are going to put there like signs for people who died in the process of building Casa Poporului. Because there were a lot of people dying in working accidents. It was a crazy enterprise with tens of thousands of people working every day in location, and they were working in 3 shifts, 24 hours. 7 days a week, and of course there was a very exhausting enterprise, and people were dying. And as it happens, I was crossing that area in front of the palace because there was no public transportation from where I lived. It was suspended, and I had to go to my work, which guess where? It was in the National Museum of Art of that time. So it seems that it comes back on and off. So it was a museum of modern art, not of contemporary art. And I was just walking through the construction site. And on and off I was seeing these little signs, like the one you can barely see there, with the name and with the formula, Rest His Soul in Peace. And that's how I came to the conclusion that probably those people died there violently. And then, of course, those signs were removed very quickly. Okay, so this is from the period when we were, dealing with the communist past with Sabriel. We were doing a lot of installations and interventions, and we were working with the idea of Dracula Land, because at a certain point, after dealing with our own problems from the 80s, and, commenting on the harshness and absurdity of life in the 80s, like 10 years later, which was kind of embarrassing, but that's how it went. At a certain point, we got somehow popular with this kind of work, and we started to be invited outside of Romania, and then suddenly we realized that there is this kind of obsessive, showcasing of Eastern Europeans in a certain kind of way, and especially of Romanians, like coming from the country of Dracula. This was absolutely irritating. I mean, as soon as you were saying, yeah, I'm from Romania, oh, Dracula. So then we started this longish term project about Dracula. It was called Dracula Land. And it was basically putting a mirror in front of our audiences and telling them, well, Dracula Land, it's not our land, it's your land. It's basically how you see us, but it's basically how you are. So that was. Oh, Casa Poporului, look, this is the Palace of Ceausescu again. So this is an installation which is called the Castle from the Carpathians, Castelul din Carpați, or in original, Le Château des Carpates. And this is a 19th century novel by Jules Verne, which is a very unexpected and very Jules Vernean interpretation of Dracula. So it's about a person who is extremely, a count in Transylvania who is extremely familiar with the latest technological inventions, and who brings from death his lover, who is an opera singer, through some holograms and some sophisticated stuff. And at the same time, he's completely controlling the peasants on his domains. It's very much like a Bram Stoker's thing, but put in the morphology of Jules Verne. Now, the funny thing is, I don't know if we have this image here. Oh, that's not good. The funny thing is that the most popular cigarette in Romania during the communist time is Carpați, the Carpathian cigarettes. So we built up a palace of Ceausescu. We took the blueprints from an architect's bureau, and we built a scale model of that palace made of Carpathian cigarettes. So it was Le Château de Carpath, which was made of the Carpathian cigarettes, the healthy thing. Okay. Yeah, well, that's what we did in Berlin. It's a whole series of things which is called the Art History Archive. And by the way, this is the show we did in Berliner Kunstverein at the end of our stay, and this is our studio in Bethanien, when Kunsthaus Bethanien was in that very funny pseudo-romantic, pseudo-Gothic building in Mariannenplatz, I think, in Kreuzberg, where it sits no more there. Anyway, and we worked for 1 year making event after event around and with the material provided by a huge archive of photographs and negatives from an art magazine in Romania. An art magazine where both my partner Josip Krai and myself worked for quite some years, and which has been, in the turmoil of the 90s, has been a victim of the liberalization of economy and of culture. And its archive of photographs and negatives has been literally thrown away, and we were luckily helped by the then director of the Museum of Contemporary Art, who gave us some people and some trucks to put it in our studio. And from there we took it to Berlin, and we did a lot of work about how art history and how our perception of art history is filtered through black and white photography, and how you can manipulate this kind of relationship, intermediated relationship, and how can you falsify or intensify your relation with visual arts. And the first piece, which was probably also the centerpiece of our stay in Berlin, was Data Room. And our studio was completely covered with photographs that we were just pulling out from packages and from bags, and we're just putting on the walls, and then slowly we were discovering something that was already well known by people who worked with big amounts of data. The data has sort of own rationality, that it starts to, make links with each other, and you have an image and you put it next to another image, and a story starts to occur, and you put a third image and the fourth image, and from the fifth image on, the way you do it is already conscious, because you say, okay, I already have something here, so let's look for the next piece in the puzzle. So slowly we started to make clusters of themes and of subjects from our wallpaper, so-called wallpaper. And then what was funny is that we were basically, initially we wanted to have 1 day a week. This installation opened, and then we had to give up, and basically we moved in another studio, and people were coming there every day, because it was a very fascinating piece, and people were taking a lot of time in exploring those images, and you could almost see that everybody had another trajectory. Everybody was following something different. They were seeing something different in them. So that's the art history archive thing. And yeah, then a couple of years later, we started working with deal with what's here. We started working with the negatives from the archive, which we considered in the beginning just a self-evident source of the images we worked with. So we thought we knew what you have there. But then when we made some proofreads, we realized that the photos we are using in their physicality, the prints on paper, were basically just crops of something completely different. And we realized that due to the fact that the camera was a 6x6 camera, so it had a square, negative, it was always impossible to fill the frame with the image, which has other proportions, and you always had something happening around it. And usually what was happening around it was those people who were holding something, trying to give a background, trying to help the photographer make the best of the chef-d'oeuvre, of the big masterpiece. And we started to call those people art servants. So they were the people who were serving art, who were, you know, bowing in front of the art object. And people who, you know, through the through the chains of events, as I already said several times, mysterious chains of events, they became actually the centerpiece of the image. And they were making the image valuable, because what you have here is something which is going to the trash of history. It's a very sad story about the overproduction, the inflationary production in art and visual. But the living situation, the people who are, you know, operating with and around the artwork, they are staying, because the people are, of course, always important. They are making the narrative living, and they are something we are constantly turning towards, the people, the art servants, or the servants of whatever. And then we ended up by cropping and isolating. We ended up in an installation which is quite extreme, and where then we started to try to figure out how we could bring that in our own existence, because we were traveling a lot with Josip, and from residence to residence. There was this kind of strategy we had then, and I'm not so sure about what I hear from my younger colleagues. I think that strategy is still functioning, but probably not in such a luxurious way it did in the 90s and 2000s. I think that the public money and the money for residency is probably shrinking. But people, of course, need to have this time off, their own existence and their own place, and to be somewhere and isolate themselves in their work. But for us, this became a routine, and we wanted to, not to go into a studio, but the opposite, to go into a city, go out of the studio and try to explore it. And to explore it easier and more effectively, we were working with our colleagues. So what we did, we invented a sort of a routine which was imitating what we had in the archive with the art servants, except that we became the art servants. And we started to make portraits of people we were in contact with in their own environments, and making from them the centerpiece, as it should be, because people are more centered, and putting ourselves in this, let's say, performative position, if you want. And then we also went to conquer the city, to make landscapes. It was part of the same cycle, which is called interviewing the city. So portraits of people in their environment, and then portraits of urban sites, which were memorable or they were just funny. And then we were using, of course, sort of a the camera lucinda, the optical illusion, because what we had here, of course, is just an empty frame and a piece of fabric. And we were trying to, you know, match in parallelism the frame plane and the plane of the film, and to frame in such a way the motif that you wouldn't even really tell that this is part of the landscape. Nothing indicates that you have here a harbor. Then you have, you know, a romantic photograph of a yacht, you see. And that whole thing was very laborious, and we had to work with several people around us, because we had to carry a lot of equipment and the chairs and tripods, etc. And we always had to have an assistant who was focusing the camera and saying, well, you're having a bad shadow on your face, or you're not holding the frame right. So it was an extremely intense and also sometimes very painful process, because, you know, you have hard temperatures, extreme heat, or very cold, and it's windy, and the fabric is moving, and the frame is not right. And the conclusion of all this hardship was that people were having intense fun, because more it took in one location, more you had people around you having a great laugh and trying to pop up in the frame and ruining the picture. And again, I think that was a very important dimension of what we did, besides the fact that we were in an ironic way mimicking, 19th century photography. At the same time, we were offering a moment of entertainment and a moment of, I call that, an intimate contact with the processes of conceptual art, contemporary art. Okay. This is a bit about some real. Oh yeah, and then we did things with museums. They were playing with the trumpet, but I think it's not gonna work for you. The images are not. I still think that I would like to show you a couple of things. Just a real sample from what I'm working on right now, and which is again connected to the building I'm working in. And it's connected to Bucharest, and it's connected to, in more than one way, to society and to, social and cultural responsibility. And this project is just starting up, and we are putting together an interdisciplinary team in order to work it. And it's called Collective Authorship. And Collective Authorship is looking at architecture not from a moral point of view, but from a pragmatic point of view. And I think it's a step forward in my idea of what emotional architecture means really. So when I started to work with this concept of emotional architecture, I wasn't really well read in phenomenology, but that was basically what it was about. It's, Paul Asma and those architects work phenomenologically and who are talking very much about the way you communicate with your environment and how it goes both ways, and then you're in that place, in this place at the same time you are in other places mentally, and you look at that building, but the building looks at you in a certain way. Mind you, this is not crazy talk here I'm talking about. It's just that there is this phenomenological exchange which happens constantly. That's emotional architecture. But for me, it started from this very intense clash between political will and the dynamic of society, which brought together the political center, the administrative center in the middle of Bucharest. Now, collective authorship takes this into a sort of more pragmatic direction and looks at how things happen in architecture. Now, things in architecture happen collectively. And this is something it's a commonplace, of course, like the fact that relations with architecture are emotional, it's also commonplace. But those are commonplaces which are very essential because we don't look at them. We live them, we live within their midst, but we don't look at them in an analytical way. So the fact that a piece of architecture, a building, a street, a square, etc., is a collective product. Yeah, it is a collective. No. It's a collective product of the people who are making it and the people who are using it. And there is a collective responsibility about its appearance and about its functioning, and it's about its disappearance. And this responsibility, that's a very important point, it's not a moral responsibility. It's a pragmatic responsibility. It's about what you do and who you are. That's not about morals. It's not about pointing fingers. So the fact that hundreds of thousands of people work in various capacities and at various moments in the production of such a bizarre building as the palace in Bucharest is not about, morals. It's about how things work historically. And it's very interesting to look at that in order to see what you put in, what you get from that, how you can stream these kind of energies into the future. And those ideas started to work for me in an unexpected way in the middle of the years 2000 when I was conducting a social integration project in a penitentiary in north of Bucharest. It was a project which was put together by the Ministry of Justice from the Netherlands and the Ministry of Justice from Romania, who were having a sort of strategic matching in order to improve the ways the penitentiaries in Romania are conducted, organized, etc., etc. And the Dutch won, I think, a context of expertise at the European Union level in order to counsel Romania. And through this complicated bureaucratic gate I came in because there was also a part which was saying that culture is important in such an environment, and it can help in social reintegration, which is true, but it depends how you do that. And the claim was that the Dutch know how to do it, and because it was a matching fund project, they were needing somebody who would be a go-betweener. So I was both a Romanian citizen and a Dutch citizen. I was speaking Romanian, but I was also somebody who could be made accountable for responsibilities in the Netherlands. So that's how I was plunging into this very complicated situation, working with people in a high-security prison in Colibaș, a place north of Bucharest, 120 kilometers from Bucharest. And I took over this project because I was extremely curious how far you can go in that way, because I was extremely skeptical about the politically correct things that are said and are claimed to be possible in such an environment. And otherwise, I was curious really if I could master myself in such a situation, which I perceived as being quite scary. There were some, you had documentary films about how things are in Romanian prisons and this and that, and anyway, you get it from the start that this is not going to be a holiday situation. And it's a project which took, I think, almost 3 years to build up, because I took it extremely slowly and because I wanted really to understand the mechanics of it. So I made an analysis in my own terms and with my own tools of the institution at the level of the people working there, the civil servants, the guards, the leadership, the managers, etc. And then when I felt confident enough to have a dialogue with those people and to understand, when I thought that I understood a bit their position, I went to the level of the convicts. And then it took a lot of time to explore their universe and to understand really what they are about. And I knew very, very well what I wanted to do, but I had to understand if what I wanted to do is acceptable. And what I wanted to do is, was something that could involve those people and give them a reward, because the preliminary phase of my dialogue with the institutions made it very clear that I cannot bring to those people anything they would need directly. I mean, I couldn't pay them if they work with me. I couldn't provide them with extra food or clothing or anything. There was, legally it was not possible, and the legal frame there was extremely, extremely strict. And of course, I didn't have the budgets to transform miraculously from one day to another a prison environment into something different, or to make it from a Romanian prison into a Dutch prison. So then I thought that probably and by talking with other people with more experience than me, I thought that probably the obvious is that those people are, interested in socializing outside their circle. They could, they have the rudiments to learn a small poem or to sing some silly songs. And I said, well, probably we're going to make together a theater piece. And that will force people to work outside with me, with actors, with trainers, with composers, with musicians, etc. And it will force them to have a discipline, which obviously they didn't have, and to have a discipline on very narrow tasks, which is easier for people who are not highly educated. And then it gave them a sort of horizon, because people who were volunteering to work with me and were embarking in this project were supposed to have a timeline of, 6 months maybe to get the proper training, and then we were supposed to make a public presentation in city of Kolibash. It's a small city, it's a larger village, but also one in Bucharest, and that's what we did. And that was a completely crazy enterprise in absolutely all the ways possible. And the people, you know, the officials in the ministry and in the prison were 1000% behind it, and it was sad, but it was also interesting to see how you know, the Odeon Theatre in Bucharest, which is an experimental theatre in the center, which hosts a lot of events of different kinds, was completely invaded by policemen with guns, and and the actors came with shackles on their hands, and then, well, they were freed inside, and then there was this event, and it was completely packed. And it was an enormous enthusiasm from the audience. And those people were, for a night, you know, they were transfigurated. So there was this kind of Andy Warhol moment of freedom. And, you know, that's all you can give them. But, or I could give them. I couldn't give them more than that. And I'm going to show you a bit of that, of film I made around this experience. And if you want to hear why is this also about collective responsibility, we'll talk in the, how you call it, in the dialogue stuff. Because I think if you are not tired, I am, and I think I'll stop it. Okay? Skip some parts. So, and it goes on like this. This is a very tight editing of some of the layers which were involved in this project. So on one hand, we were trying to help them learn some poems and to exercise their memory and to exercise also their capacity to work together to make sort of like an antique choir. And on the other hand, there is that layer of my preliminary talks with them, which were conducted one-on-one, and which became very quickly stereotypical in the sense that they were having a specific kind of, on one hand, the stories were repeating the same type of routines, which were the routines of telling you, or trying to persuade you that they are innocent, that they are there for the wrong reason. And on the other hand, it was slipping inevitably into the commonplaces of criminal life, which is always making you, tearing you apart as an audience, because there is always a innocent root to it, in the sense that that person is as much victim of circumstances, poverty, lack of schooling, violent environment, etc., as is the result of his or her own wrong choices. And it's very hard to witness that on and on and on, but at the same time it becomes easier in the sense that it becomes very itemized. So there is a routine of keywords, and there is a routine of how you call that, rhetorics, which gives you a sign that those people are in a way empowered by their discourse, and they are trying to control you in a way, and they are trying to position themselves in a way which puts them in a kind of, you know, positive relation with you. And that was to this language mechanism and to the mechanisms of the interview. I started to level myself in the relation with them. I feel less guilty and less manipulative in the work I did. Okay, I'm stopping here. Thank you very much. If there are questions for this moment or later on, we can still go on like that. Thank you.
Yeah, Călin, thank you very much. It was really very impressive, and I think also for me, quite especially the last short view into this work was quite disturbing in a way, and I think it takes also time to think about this kind of short experience of a very long experience you made. But you mentioned also like this was somehow connected to a question of authorship. Yeah. Could you define that a little bit more?
Well, yeah, that's part of my unpreparedness here. In 2010, I made an exhibition of all those interviews in a form of a video installation where every one of those voices, let's call them, every one of those individuals was having a dedicated monitor. And this installation was built for and presented in the Museum of Contemporary Art in a couple of spaces which are preserving the initial decoration designed for the building by the architects during the Ceausescu period in the 80s. And I was doing it because slowly, while working with them in that penitentiary environment, I realized that in a very perverse, very indirect, and maybe a bit delirious way, the existence they were having there and the things I was confronted with were somehow the result of the same process which brought into existence the palace of Ceausescu and which brought into existence the whole regime in which we were, you know, collectively involved as authors, as participants. So maybe what I'm talking about here is a bit fuzzy, and it goes again to that kind of two-penny phenomenology I told you in the beginning, but it's basically about this. So there is a kind of collective authorship of us, you know, bringing those people in that confined environment. We are somehow as society pushing them in a corner. On the other hand, they are also part of a process where all of us are responsible for what's happening. And it's about the palace which is crashing down existences of people, and it's about people, you know, steering restlessness and things from the subterranean within that palace. So that's a bit how it came to mind. And I think that was the first level of my dealing with the fact that this is not a building about a certain regime or about a certain person who wanted it, but it's the result of a collective dynamic. So maybe that's answering a bit the question.
Are there other questions? So I would like to thank you all for coming and joining us here for the evening. I think the exhibition will be open for another 20 minutes, something like that. So if you want to see the exhibition, please take the opportunity. Thank you very much for coming, and thank also to the Romanian Institute for the support and all the people here from the Albrecht collection for staying out a little bit later than usual. Thank you.